Our gospel reading for this morning comes from Luke's gospel. It is what for some of us will be the familiar parable of the prodigal. It is part of 3 parables Jesus tells in a row to address the situation that you'll hear in just a moment. The parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal all speak to those who aren't quite sure about Jesus hanging out with the riffraff. Listen for what the Spirit may say to us this day. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees and scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So Jesus told them this parable. And as I said, there's a parable and another parable. And then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on, and he replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat, so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then his father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life, was lost and has been found.'" The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. How many of you enjoy a good dinner party or a big cookout or a great wedding reception that has lots of good food and drink? I know I like nothing better than to gather together with friends at a party, a cookout, where there's good food, good wine. I've been to some such events that, made me want to sound like a commercial and go, life doesn't get any better than this. And it turns out Jesus thought along the same lines. When Jesus goes to speak about the day that God is bringing, he doesn't borrow the imagery of a prophet like Isaiah, who speaks of a peaceable kingdom and the wolf and the lamb living together. Instead, he speaks of a great wedding banquet. Now, weddings were the social occasions in Jesus' day. They were often lavish affairs, and they would last all week long. And Jesus speaks of these when he wants to talk about what God is going to do, what God is going to bring. And he says, people shall come from east and west, from north and south, to eat in the kingdom of God. And the book of Revelation sounds a very similar note as it moves towards its joyful conclusion, saying, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. In the very early church, when they gathered for worship, they gathered at table for a meal at which the Lord's Supper would be celebrated. The imagery is pretty much lost on us today, but those Christians understood themselves as they gathered at table to be participating in a preview of that great grand banquet that was to come. And we still say at the table, this is the joyful feast, even if the little meager cups and stuff on the table don't quite look like a grand party. I wonder if a sociologist who had never experienced anything about Christianity ever came and studied American congregations, I wonder if she would ever conclude that our faith is headed towards a great grand party. Somebody apparently thinks not. I mean, American faith, Christianity, is so individualistic. It's about my salvation or about my spirituality. In many congregations, you can be a member in good, even great standing, without any real sense of a community gathered for a joyful feast. Many seem uninterested in joining the party. Now, party figures prominently in our gospel reading for today. We only hear about two of the invitees to this party. The first invitee does not think he deserves to be there, and the second invitee does not want to go. We don't know at the end of the party exactly what happens. Presumably, the first invitee is there inside at the party, but we never hear whether or not the second invitee ever actually goes in. This problem of undeserving guest and unwilling guest emerges because of the rather odd behavior of the host of the party, who turns out is their father. This father has acted in rather strange ways in this parable we often refer to as the parable of the prodigal. And prodigal normally refers to the second son who has blown through the money and extravagant, wild living. Now, I don't know about you, but prodigal's not a word I hear very often in casual conversation. When I looked it up in the dictionary, it spoke of someone who spends money or resources freely and recklessly. Wasteful extravagance, using or having something in lavish abundance. That certainly would apply to the son, the younger son, but it also applies to the father. I mean, after all, the father gives the younger son his inheritance ahead of time, despite the complete impropriety of such a request. And then he turns around and throws a grand party for this ne'er-do-well who has so disrespected his inheritance. It is strange behavior, to say the least, even irresponsible sort of behavior. And the responsible, dutiful older son cannot bear it and will not join in it. It's not in the story, but I've always wondered whether or not that younger son was a little nervous about the situation. I imagine him inside the party kind of warily looking around, wondering if Dad might come to his senses and change his mind. But the parable seems not to even consider this issue. After all, the parable is not told to people like the younger son. The parable is addressed to older sibling types, people like me and perhaps many of you. Responsible folks who do our jobs, pay our bills, turn our homework in on time. Yes, it's quite possible that younger sibling types worry about whether or not they really belong at the party. But Jesus' parable seems more worried about older siblings who may boycott the party and so miss out on it entirely. Now, we Protestants have long celebrated the grace of God, the way that God gives so freely and liberally without us deserving it, but only to a point. We still expect that God will take due notice of our responsible, dutiful lives. And so our faith is chock full of rules about decorum and about what you should do and believe if you really want an invite from God. We're still just a little nervous about a God who is too much like the father in the parable, a God who is too quick to party. Now, I'm not knocking duty or responsibility. I'm all for them, in fact. My wife and I tried very hard to raise responsible children. But still, we dutiful, responsible types just aren't quite sure what to do with the God that Jesus shows us. Now, I could add that responsible types have sustained churches over the generations. People who pledge and tithe and who never fail to live up to that pledge have long kept church budgets in the black. In fact, one of the reasons that so many church budgets are struggling these days is that a generation of dutiful, responsible, loyal, institutional givers is beginning to age out. And later generations are not necessarily less responsible, but they certainly are less loyal and attached to institutions and to congregations. Now, some stewardship programs have sought to address this sort of loyalty problem by re-emphasizing the spiritual discipline of the tithe, of giving a proportion, the first portion of your income to God. Learning this spiritual discipline is a key element of the life of faith. Yet, it can become just one more dutiful responsibility, like paying the mortgage, with little hint of the joyful, extravagant love and generosity of our God. Indeed, I'm not sure I've ever heard the term extravagant used in the same sentence with a church budget. I'm not sure the two terms go together. Even in the heyday of the church in the 1950s, nobody's talked about extravagant and budget in the same breath. Even in the best of times, church stewardship campaigns very often brought in just enough money to meet the budget, to do the things that we need to do and have to do. That's why I can't help but wondering if the Spirit wasn't moving when the Stewardship Committee chose its theme for this year, our community of joyful givers. Joyful givers. Not responsible folks who are paying the bills or dutifully doing our part, but people who have somehow been touched by the extravagant, prodigal generosity of God, and so cannot help but overflow in an extravagant generosity of their own. Joyful givers. Maybe even people who are ready to party. I hope so. I hope so, because an extravagant, prodigal God is throwing a party. A party that's not quite what it's supposed to be until each one of us goes in and takes our place. All praise and glory to the wonderful, extravagant, prodigal God that we meet in Jesus. Thanks be to God.